All right, so let's dive into this EU opinion on data protection and AI models.
Sounds good.
I know legal documents aren't always the most exciting thing to read.
Right.
But this one's really important for anyone working with data and AI.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially when it comes to, using data responsibly and ethically in our professional lives.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting about this opinion is that it was actually specifically requested by the Irish Supervisory Authority.
Oh, wow.
One of the bodies that's responsible for enforcing the GDPR.
Right.
And so they're really grappling with, real world questions about how to apply these data protection principles to this rapidly evolving world of AI.
So we're not just talking theory here. We're talking about, what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. Real world applications and the challenges that companies are facing.
Yeah, and it's all happening within this framework of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR,
Right.
which, a lot of people consider the gold standard for data protection globally.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's start with something that might seem a little counterintuitive.
Okay.
The opinion tackles this idea of anonymous AI.
Right.
Is it truly anonymous if it's been trained on personal data?
It's a great question, and I think one that a lot of people are, struggling with.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, you might think that if an AI model doesn't actually spit out your name or address,
Right.
it's anonymous. But the opinion highlights this really crucial point.
Okay.
Even if personal data isn't directly identifiable, it can still be encoded in the AI's parameters.
Encoded. I'm having a hard time visualizing what that actually means.
Yeah, so think about it this way.
Okay.
Imagine you're training an AI model to predict customer churn, right?
Mm-hmm.
You feed it this massive data set of customer information, including things like purchase history,
Right.
demographics, browsing behavior.
Yeah.
Even if that final model doesn't output any of that specific information directly, those data points can still be subtly reflected in the model's decision-making process.
Interesting.
It's like baking a cake. You can't see the individual ingredients anymore,
Right.
but their essence is still there shaping the final product.
So even if I can't see, those individual data points, they're still kind of baked into the AI's logic
Yeah.
and potentially influencing its outputs.
Precisely. And the opinion highlights that supervisory authorities will consider reasonable means
Okay.
that could be used to extract this encoded information.
Okay.
So they're going to look at the AI's design, the source of its training data, and even how vulnerable it is to attacks.
So they're really doing their due diligence.
Yeah. Essentially, they're saying that even if a company claims that their AI is anonymous, you shouldn't just take their word for it.
Right. You have to actually look under the hood.
Exactly.
So how does this actually impact businesses, who are developing and using AI?
Well, this really puts the onus on companies to be much more transparent
Okay.
about their AI development processes. They need to be able to demonstrate how they're mitigating the risks of re-identification,
Right.
especially if they're claiming that their AI is anonymous.
Okay, let's move on to another kind of hot button issue, legitimate interest.
Yeah.
This is often the go-to justification that companies use, when they're explaining why they need our data for AI development.
Right.
So can you elaborate a little bit on what legitimate interest actually means in this context?
So it's one of the 6 lawful bases for processing personal data under the GDPR. And since the GDPR doesn't create a ranking of those bases, companies often kind of gravitate towards legitimate interest because
Right.
it seems like maybe the easiest path.
Right.
But the opinion is very clear. It's not a free pass.
So they can't just say, we have a legitimate interest and call it a day.
Not at all. The opinion lays out this 3-step test
That's
that
right.
supervisory authorities are going to apply.
Okay.
First, they'll ask, is the interest lawful, clearly defined, and real? It can't just be some vague notion of improving our services.
Right. It has to be specific.
Exactly. Second, they'll assess whether using personal data is necessary to achieve that interest.
Okay.
Could the company achieve the same goal without using personal data or by using less intrusive methods?
So could they use anonymized data or aggregated data or something?
At third, they're going to weigh the company's interest against the individual's rights and freedoms.
Okay.
Does the potential benefit to the company outweigh the potential privacy risks to the individual?
It's a balancing act.
It is.
So for our listeners, what are some red flags to watch out for?
Right.
What are some examples of these legitimate interests that companies often claim?
Yeah.
And how can we, determine if they're actually legitimate.
So you'll often hear companies claiming they need your data to improve their services, personalize user experiences, or enhance security measures like fraud detection.
So things that sound reasonable.
Exactly. And those all sound reasonable on the surface, but the key question is whether using personal data is truly necessary.
Right. Could they do it another way?
Exactly. Could they achieve those goals using anonymized data, aggregated data, even synthetic data?
So basically, they need to prove that they've exhausted all other options before resorting to using our personal data.
That's the idea. And this is where I think you as a data professional can really make a difference by advocating for these privacy-enhancing techniques and pushing back against these overly broad claims of legitimate interest.
Right.
You can help ensure that data is used responsibly and ethically.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Let's talk about web scraping.
Okay.
The opinion spends a good chunk of time discussing the potential for misuse when companies gather data from publicly available sources, like social media and websites, to train their AI models.
Yeah.
So isn't all data fair game if it's publicly available?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the opinion makes it clear that just because data is publicly available, it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all.
Yeah.
There's this notion of reasonable expectation of privacy, even in the digital age.
So unpack reasonable expectation for me.
Okay.
What does that actually mean in practice?
Okay, so think about it this way. You might post a funny anecdote on social media,
Right.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that you consent to it being scraped and used to train an AI chatbot.
Right, or an advertising algorithm or something.
Exactly. The context matters.
So what are some of the biggest challenges that companies are facing in this web scraping Wild West?
Yeah.
And how can they ensure that they're not, overstepping boundaries?
One of the biggest challenges is figuring out what actually constitutes a reasonable expectation of privacy in different contexts. And the opinion suggests that companies should go beyond the bare minimum requirements of the GDPR and adopt additional safeguards.
Can you give us some examples of what those safeguards might look like?
Absolutely. They suggest things like honoring websites that specifically object to scraping, giving individuals more control over what data gets scraped, and even creating opt-out lists for people who don't want their data used for AI training.
So basically giving people more agency over how their data is used, even if it's publicly available.
Yeah, it's about respecting those boundaries.
Right, because even if it's out there, it doesn't mean that, companies have a free pass to do whatever they want with it.
Exactly, and I think that's a really important shift in thinking.
So these safeguards sound like a step in the right direction, but what happens when companies don't play by the rules?
Right.
What are the consequences if AI is trained on data that was obtained illegally?
That's where things get really tricky from a legal and ethical standpoint.
Yeah.
The opinion actually lays out 3 distinct scenarios, depending on whether that illegally obtained data is still present in the AI and who's currently using the AI.
Okay, so let's break down those scenarios. Let's start with maybe the most straightforward one. What happens if a company trains an AI on illegally obtained data?
Right.
That data is still in the AI.
Yeah.
And the same company that originally obtained the data is now using it.
So in that case, the opinion is pretty clear. Supervisory authorities have the power to step in and take corrective measures. They can issue fines. They can order the company to delete the illegally obtained data or even demand the deletion of the entire AI if necessary.
Wow, so they're not messing around.
No, they're not.
Right.
The point is that, using the AI, even for a seemingly legitimate purpose, is tainted by that original act of obtaining the data unlawfully.
So even if the AI is being used to, say, detect fraud or optimize marketing campaigns, the fact that it was built on this foundation of, bad data makes the whole thing problematic.
Exactly. It undermines the legitimacy of the whole operation.
Yeah.
And this is where the concept of data provenance becomes so crucial.
Right. You need to be able to trace the origins of your data.
Yeah.
And demonstrate, a clear and legal chain of custody.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to the second scenario, which gets a bit more complicated.
Okay.
What if the AI was trained on illegally obtained data? That data is still in the AI, but now a different company is using it.
Right. So maybe they bought it or licensed it or acquired it through some other means.
Exactly.
So the question here is, does the new company inherit the responsibility for that original sin of the illegally obtained data?
That's a great question. And the opinion suggests that, yes, they could be held accountable.
Oh, wow.
Supervisory authorities will expect the new company to have done their due diligence.
Okay.
Did they thoroughly investigate the AI's origins, how it was trained?
Right.
And whether any data protection violations occurred during its development?
So for anyone working in a company that's, looking to acquire or implement third-party AI systems,
right,
this is a huge red flag.
It is. You can't just assume that everything is above board.
Yeah, ignorance is not a defense.
Exactly. You have a responsibility to scrutinize the AI's development process, especially the data used to train it. And this due diligence needs to be documented.
Yeah.
If a supervisory authority comes knocking, you need to be able to demonstrate that you took all reasonable steps to ensure that the AI was developed ethically and legally.
Okay, on to the third scenario, which sounds like the most complex one.
Okay.
What happens if a company trains an AI on illegally obtained data, but then they try to clean up their act by anonymizing the AI?
Yeah.
So personal data can no longer be extracted. Does that absolve them of any wrongdoing?
This is where it gets nuanced. The opinion makes a distinction between the AI itself and the act of obtaining the data.
Okay.
If the AI is truly anonymized, meaning that personal data can't be extracted by any reasonable means, then the GDPR no longer applies to the operation of the AI.
Yeah.
It's essentially treated as a clean slate.
So in that specific case, the original sin of the illegal data is kind of wiped away?
In terms of the AI's ongoing operation, yes. However, and this is crucial, the original unlawful act of obtaining the data can still be investigated and penalized by supervisory authorities.
Oh, wow. So it doesn't completely get them off the hook.
No. Anonymizing the AI doesn't erase the initial violation.
So it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
If you're a company that used illegal data to train your AI anonymizing, it might shield you from some liability going forward, but you can still face consequences for that initial data grab.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it gets even more interesting because the opinion also points out that if during the deployment phase, this anonymized AI is used to process NW personal data, the GDPR will apply to that new processing.
Okay. Can you give an example of what that might look like in a real-world scenario?
Sure. Let's say you have an AI-powered chatbot that was originally trained on illegally obtained data, but then anonymized. The operation of the chatbot itself wouldn't be subject to the GDPR. But if that chatbot then collects personal information from users during conversations, like names, email addresses, or payment details, that new processing would fall under the GDPR.
So it's like this layered approach to data protection.
Exactly.
The anonymized AI itself might be exempt, but any new processing of personal data that it's involved in is subject to the full force of the law.
Exactly. And this just highlights the need for ongoing vigilance and awareness. Just because you've anonymized an AI doesn't mean you can completely disregard data protection principles.
Wow, it feels like we've covered so much ground already.
Oh, no, right?
But it's clear that AI and data protection is such a, complex and constantly evolving landscape.
It really is. And I think this EU opinion really highlights how important it is for everyone who's involved in the AI ecosystem to be proactive and informed. Right.
It's not just about following the letter of the law.
Right.
It's also about embracing the spirit of the GDPR, which is ultimately about respecting people's data rights.
I couldn't agree more. And, we've talked a lot about the legal ramifications, but let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What does all of this actually mean for our listeners?
Right.
In their day-to-day professional lives?
Yeah. Let's bring it home.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways that data professionals and anyone working with AI should be thinking about?
Well, first and foremost, you need to be informed.
Okay.
Understand how your company is using data, especially when it comes to AI development. Don't just blindly trust that everything is being done by the book.
Right.
Ask questions, challenge assumptions, and really be an advocate for responsible data practices.
I think that's such an important point. We often get so caught up in the technical details of our work.
Right.
But it's easy to forget to step back and think about the ethical implications as well.
Absolutely. And this goes beyond just individual awareness.
Okay.
Companies need to foster a culture of data ethics.
Where privacy and transparency are core values.
Right.
Not just something you tack on as an afterthought.
So it's about baking those considerations into the very fabric of your, AI development process.
Exactly. And that might mean investing in privacy-enhancing technologies, adopting stricter data governance policies, or even, rethinking your entire approach to AI development.
Right, because if AI is truly going to benefit society, it needs to be built on this foundation of trust and respect for individuals.
Precisely. And that brings us to, I think, a final thought that's worth pondering.
Okay.
This opinion really underscores how much AI development relies on these vast amounts of data.
Right.
So the question is, how do we balance this hunger for data with the need to protect individual privacy? Is there a better way forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we've seen how tricky it can be to even define anonymous AI.
Right.
And you know how companies can sometimes kind of stretch that legitimate interest justification pretty far? Yeah. It's a constant tension. Yeah. And the opinion actually hints at some potential solutions.
Great.
Like encouraging the development of AI that relies less on these massive personal data sets, or promoting techniques like differential privacy, which can help protect individual privacy while still enabling AI training.
So it's not just about saying no to AI.
Right.
It's about exploring these alternative paths that prioritize both innovation and privacy.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, this is where your voice becomes so important.
Okay.
As AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives,
Right.
we need to be demanding more transparency, more control, and more ethical data practices from the companies that are developing these technologies.
It's about shaping the future of AI in a way that benefits all of us.
Yes.
Not just a select few.
I think that's well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the EU opinion on AI and data protection, I really want to encourage all of our listeners to keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep pushing for a future where AI is developed and used responsibly and ethically.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has.
And thanks so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
I hope you'll join us again for another deep dive into the world of data and technology.